Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of my library and foundation colleagues, I am delighted to welcome all of you this evening who are watching our program online. Thank you so much for joining us. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. When John F. Kennedy delivered his inaugural address 60 years ago next week, he faced unprecedented tumult and global unease. And while those challenges loomed large in his speech, it was his simple challenge to ask all Americans to ask what you can do for your country that remains one of the most consequential acts of presidential leadership in American history. By asking Americans to work for causes greater than themselves and dedicate their talents to the betterment of their country and humankind, he sparked a movement that has inspired generations and redefined what it means to be an engaged citizen in a democracy. 60 years later, we are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the challenges and the opportunities for the incoming administration with our distinguished guests this evening. And since some of those challenges are unfolding as we speak, I tip my hat to our wonderful guests for being game to help us all grapple with the current situation in Washington and what it might mean for the administration. On that note, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so pleased to extend a warm virtual welcome to the library to Lisa Lerer, a reporter at the New York Times covering campaigns, elections, and political power. Before joining the Times, she was a national political writer at the Associated Press, where she was a lead reporter on the 2016 presidential race. She previously reported for Politico, Bloomberg News, Business Week, and the American Lawyer magazine. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 2017. I'm also delighted to welcome Julian Zelizer. He is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He is the author and editor of 21 books, including most recently Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party. He also co-hosts a popular podcast called Politics and Polls. I'm also so pleased to welcome Harry Smith, our moderator for this evening's discussion, to the library virtually. One of television's most distinguished journalists, he's currently an NBC News correspondent and has been news anchor for more than 30 years. Before joining NBC in 2011, he hosted the CBS News morning shows, The Early Shows, and its predecessor, CBS This Morning, for 17 years. He has interviewed a who's who of world leaders from Barack Obama to Margaret Thatcher and has won several Emmy Awards and a Murrow Award, as well as numerous other honors. Please join me in welcoming our special guest this evening. Over to you, Harry.
Thanks so much, Rachel. This is really going to be fun, we hope, and we're excited about the opportunity to get out of our own heads perhaps a little bit and have a conversation about what I think was maybe a naive title when it was written for this hour, the new administration opportunities and challenges, that maybe needed to be rewritten in bold type. So let's just start with today. Lisa, impeachment for the second time, the first time in history. And what can we even begin to conceive what this will mean to a new administration?
Well, it's certainly historic. As you point out, it's the second time in history that, the first time in history, a president has been impeached for the second time. So this is certainly really the end of Trump's legacy, in so much as I think the president and his supporters wanted to tout his legacy, at least in the short term. It sort of cements his position as a pariah president. He's already been corporate America has distanced themselves from him. Certainly Democrats distanced themselves from him at the beginning of the administration. But, New York City said today that they're taking his investments and his name down from things where he's been a presence like Central Park for decades. So, I think we are going to see a pariah post-presidency like we've never seen before, at least in the short term. The other notable thing about the vote today was that 10 Republicans broke ranks to vote for impeaching him. Frankly, this is not a lot of Republicans. There are 211 Republicans in the House right now. So this is a very, very small percentage, but it's a significant percentage given that it's a bigger bipartisan vote than we've seen in any other impeachment, and given that the stranglehold that the president has had on his party. So I don't think by any means that this is a sign the Republican Party is breaking with Trump, but I think we are beginning to see a little air there that we didn't see before. And I certainly think there's an aspiration among some Republicans, particularly Republican leaders, that now they see an opportunity to maybe put some of the divisive politics of the Trump era, which they think has hurt the party in some ways, behind them. Whether they'll be able to make on that opportunity remains to be seen. The president has a really strong hold amongst Republicans in the states and local jurisdictions. This is still President Trump's Republican Party, but that number of 10 Republicans is significant, I think.
I don't think anybody saw that coming. You know what? Let's talk about Mitch McConnell in a minute or two and what he said, because he basically cracked the door open and said, I'm good by this. I'm good by this. And especially the notion that was reported that the separation of Trump from the rest of the Republican Party. That's a whole, we'll get to that in a minute or two. But Julian, I'm going to re-ask that question then. So you're the Biden administration, and a week from now you take office. And of the things that you know for sure is that the House has impeached the president. How does that affect how you go forward and what you want to communicate, for instance, on Inauguration Day?
Well, I think there's a practical element to the challenge and a more agenda setting challenge, meaning he does have to respond. He has to express how this fits into what he wants to do. He has to talk about the transition, not just from turbulence to governance, but also about restoring a healthier presidency, to restore the balance of power and recreate norms. There's ways in which I think he can fit it with some of the themes that he ran on in a much more dramatic fashion. And I think a lot of the shock and awe that the impeachment resulted from, Congress being physically attacked and members being physically attacked, offers an opportunity to actually continue with the message about a return to some sort of normal governance. So I think there's ways in which he can craft an inaugural speech that doesn't ignore this. It doesn't say, well, we're moving on, but actually offers continuity. Practically, it's hard. I mean, the biggest challenge is this will consume some time. It doesn't have to be an enormous amount of time, but it is valuable time. The first 100 days, the first 200 days is just, that's your best bet usually in terms of trying to push some big measure. And I'm sure the administration is worried about what will this do if the Senate takes a break, so to speak, to focus on this. The not good news, but the politically good news is that the major challenge is the pandemic. And I think if he's not thinking of 100 days like an FDR 100 days, but rather implementing a successful vaccine rollout and containing the surge, he can probably do that even if the trial takes place. So I think those are the two dimensions that Biden has to figure out, how this doesn't become a roadblock to that initial moment of presiding over the country.
I mean, it's interesting. As a third rail, he may just not even want to touch it. If he just says, listen, Congress is doing what it's going to do. He said maybe we could do bifurcation and figure out a way for the Senate to split their days or whatever, if he has some big ideas. And, you know, maybe that is not, if he allows that to consume himself, I think I have to agree with the notion that he's going to lose traction with the things maybe that he cares about.
Yeah, and I think he, in some ways, embodies the antithesis of what Trump was as president. And this was part of the attraction of having him in the Oval Office. So he can talk about it a little bit and let the Senate do the work, let Senator Schumer handle this. And I assume, I don't know if I keep thinking Senator McConnell is, you know, he's counting on this delay as a way to obstruct. I keep thinking that's part of why he's so open to the process and the full trial. But I do think what you're saying is correct, and there is a way to do that in this day and age.
Lisa, this is too personal a question, but do you know that does Nancy Pelosi call Joe Biden at some point and say, we're gonna impeach this guy? What do you think? Or we'd love your blessing? Or do you think that phone call takes place, or do you know if it did?
I think it did take place. We know that they spoke and that he's reached out to congressional leaders. Joe Biden is someone with a lot of really long connections with Congress. He's someone who understands how that institution works. But I think Julian is exactly right. It's really hard to know how this plays out. I mean, look, we are living in extraordinary times. And so you could see one reality where, this is a big distraction for Joe Biden. He wants a lot of what he can do can be coordinated through executive actions, through agency actions like rolling out the vaccine. But he's already said that he wants to pass a much bigger, much robust economic package. And we just don't know how the politics of this impeachment are going to shake out. And if that, depending how they shake out, it could be harder for him to get bipartisan support for that. It could be easier. We don't have the answer to that question. I'm not sure Republicans themselves know the direction of where their party is going. And so in some ways, I wonder if Mitch McConnell is testing the waters a little bit here to see, can he steer the party back? We don't know what kind of a force Trump is going to be able to maintain, not having the bully pulpit, not having Twitter. I can tell you that a lot of these conservative activists and local and state officials, they're sort of moving to other platforms. There's a lot of talk of conservative social media platforms springing up. And the party has been remade in Trump's image. In the RNC, for example, I think 91 of the 170 or so RNC members have turned over in the Trump era. Those 91 new members are people who support President Trump. And, you see that throughout the party, local elected officials in state houses. You see, state party chairs that not only do they support the president, but many of them are fully bought in to sort of the conspiratorial thinking of the president, even though the rioters who stormed the Capitol are certainly a very far fringe of the Republican Party, but some of the thinking that motivated that storming, that violence, is integrated in some of the mainstream of the Republican Party. And it's not clear to me how Mitch McConnell and more establishment Republicans who would like to move the party in another direction, how they exercise that poison from the system of the Republican Party. So because of that, because nobody really can say which direction the Republican Party is going, the politics become very unpredictable for Joe Biden. And the other political dynamic to keep in mind as we move forward in this is there's a very strong number of Democrats on the left who want to see a robust prosecution of the Trump administration, his allies, his supporters. I mean, I've heard people have talked to me about everything from, things like prosecuting the president beyond just impeachment and prosecuting some of his allies, some of his family members, to truth and reconciliation committees, to public apologies, to immediately firing every political appointee in the federal government. There is a real thirst for accountability among Democrats. So I do think that we could see that having impeachment happen in the first 100 days of the Biden administration could let off some of that steam, or it could whet the appetite for more. We just don't know. So I think if you're Joe Biden, there's just been you are already entering into this really unpredictable political moment. And this has just been a total shot of, I don't know what, of unprecedented extraordinary that's complicating everything for you. So I'm not even sure how, if you're sitting, I think, for people who are sitting in this incoming administration, it's really hard to game this one out.
It's interesting as we've watched him make appointments in terms of his cabinet, and I'm trying to think of the right way to put it, but they're all pretty conservative choices. They're middle of the road. There are no radicals in this. There's no one who's going to shake the system, it seems like. And if we have this sense of who Joe Biden is historically, that's very much part of his MO. What I'm curious about, Lisa and Julian, is, especially from what you were just talking about, Lisa, he's being pulled in, we're going to be pulled in a lot of different directions. And he's already made it well known. I'm trying to lean to the middle. And as you say, there are plenty of people in the party who want him, like, left full rudder right now. How does he maintain that balance when he has really different kinds of forces stretching him in different directions?
I mean, I think what we can say overall from the cabinet picks, and there are some exceptions, is that this is a center-left cabinet, probably disproportionately stocked by people who were involved with the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. He did not use this moment to bring in a new sort of generation of fresh blood into the Democratic Party, which is, it's an interesting choice. I think it's a choice that was made because of the turbulence of the times, that they really wanted people who had experience with government, that could hit the ground. Government is a massive entity, and figuring out what levers to pull, experience does matter there. But you also have the situation where Joe Biden has said that he's called himself a transitional figure. This is someone who has said that he sees himself as a bridge from one generation of Democratic politics to another era. And we haven't really, at least from these cabinet picks, gotten such a strong sense of what that next era will be. And there's certainly a very vocal, rising part of the party that's on the left that would pull him towards the left. Whether they will be successful remains to be seen. I think after this Democratic primary, where a lot of time was spent talking about proposals that were much more on the left than the party has ever experienced, the people who may be the most powerful in Joe Biden's Washington are these moderate, Democratic and Republican senators who now will be the kingmakers for legislation. But that doesn't change the overall dynamics in the Democratic Party, which are that there is this fight over what this party is going to be. And Joe Biden himself has moved to the left. He's a pretty different, his positions have definitely moved leftward since he was the vice president, as has most of the party.
Yeah, I was at a speech he gave, I don't know, maybe half a dozen years ago or so in South Carolina. And his history is rich and interesting, and who he's done business with and what side he was on lots of issues that he's switched, swerved way away from subsequently. But my question for you, Julian, is as an oldster who's old enough to remember when Jerry Ford took Richard Nixon's place, do you think there's any part of Joe Biden's mind who thinks, you know what, for the good of the country, we need to get past this stuff, and as a symbol to the Republicans to say, we want to let's figure out if we can all do this together, because I don't think we can do this like a house divided against itself, like Lincoln would have said. So that's for you, Julian, to try to wrestle with that history a little bit.
Well, I mean, very specifically in terms of some kind of pardon, like the Ford pardon of Nixon, my sense is that President-elect Biden understands that would be quite explosive at this moment, especially after today. And there was a huge backlash when Ford did it. And there's still
lost him the presidency. So
lost him the presidency. It didn't heal the nation, didn't achieve the goal. And in some ways, you can argue we're living with the legacy of that, where presidential power ultimately wasn't contained in the ways that it should be. So I don't think specifically he would do that. I do think his bias is toward moving on. He's worked his whole career. That's been his operating philosophy. And that's why he likes to talk about working with the Southern Dixiecrats and is proud of that. And that became a problem during the primaries or with the Republicans. But he's savvy. He understands that there's limits to what Republicans are going to do. He was around when, as vice president, when Obama tried to reach out and make this argument, there's no red or blue America, only to have Senator McConnell say no to almost everything. And I think he understands.
On day one, no less.
On day one. And the party has become even more radicalized since then. So I don't know. He could move on beyond President Trump. He could ignore him. He could let the impeachment, I think Lisa is right, do some of the work of achieving accountability. I don't know what else the administration is going to do, but he won't be able to move on from the Republican Party because it is what it is. And the 10 Republicans don't reflect where a lot of the party is. And it's both moved far right ideologically, and it's moved to a pretty extreme position in terms of how they govern. And he will have to deal with that as president. The Senate is a Democratic Senate now, but barely. And so Senator McConnell will return with immense power because of the filibuster. And Democrats can't afford to lose even one vote. So, does he make a choice to try to pick off Republican votes and move beyond the current moment, or does he try to focus on keeping Democrats united, as Obama ended up doing, to make sure he can get what he needs through? So even if that's his instinct, I'm not sure he can do that. And Trump will be out there. He won't have Twitter, but he'll be making noise, and kind of proto-Trump Republicans will be making noise. So I don't think any of this goes away, and he can't make it go away.
Lisa, I'm going to come back to you with some thoughts about the pandemic, and especially about financial relief. I think about how Congress responded to the Obama administration, and there were so many deficit hawks that held up money and held up funding on so many different occasions. And I'm wondering if you think the Biden administration would actually have a shot at getting the $600 ratcheted up to $2,000 for people who have been so desperately affected by the pandemic financially.
I think before the siege on the Capitol, I would have said that I think they do have a shot. I think they could, there is a strain within the Republican Party. I mean, let me back up for a second. I think it's really important to sort of underscore Julian's point, which is that the Republican Party has changed, not only in terms of the things we were sort of talking about before, the conspiratorial thinking, the QAnon stuff that's been injected into the bloodstream. Their positions have changed, right? They're much more populist. They're much more skeptical of trade. They're much more skeptical of intervening abroad. And part of what's changed is a willingness among some parts of the party to jettison some of this fiscal conservatism and embrace broader, direct relief. The president himself is the one who injected that $2,000 number into the sort of political discourse at the last minute of that last package. So I do think before the siege, there was a world where potentially Democrats could pick off enough Republicans, maybe a Josh Hawley or someone else with these populist tendencies, to come and join their side and pass a larger stimulus package. Of course, it would depend a lot on what else is in that package, and there'd be all kinds of fights over the details. I'm just not sure what the politics are going to look like after this trauma that Congress and we all collectively have gone through. I mean, Hawley is person non grata here, right? So you could see a scenario right now, certainly among Democratic circles. So you could see a scenario where Democrats don't want him to be involved with the legislation because they may see that as sort of helping him rehabilitate his image, things like that. I mean, it's just really hard to know how these dynamics are going to play out. And it's also, I think, another really big open question, to jump back to the point we were just talking about, is how much Joe Biden understands the change dynamics. I mean, he is someone who is very relationship based. He places a lot of stock in his own ability to work people and to work across the aisle. And has long relationships with some of these Republicans. And I think Julian's point is a good one. The Republican Party has changed. So has the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party has changed perhaps even more dramatically. And it's unclear if that will have the same currency. And what is clear is that the Washington he's walking into is completely different than the Washington he left, even, after the Obama administration, after those early years of McConnell obstructionism. So I think what we're likely to see, my prediction, and I'm awfully wary of predictions these days, is that
you can put an asterisk on it. It's okay.
A big asterisk, big one, is that we will see a couple months, maybe weeks, maybe months of Biden trying to cut these bipartisan deals. And if it's not happening, he'll be under a lot of pressure, and he may cave to, take slightly more radical positions, like get rid of the filibuster. And, once he realizes sort of the depth of just how deeply Congress is broken institutionally, I think he may have to sort of embrace some of these positions that have been pushed by the left wing of his party. Yeah. But, it's really hard to say. Like, it's in the wake of that attack, it's just really hard to say what the dynamics will be.
For sure. And it's interesting because you were verbalizing something I was thinking about a lot today, because Joe Biden has been true to his school in terms of his cabinet picks and everything else, and this idea that he can govern, and and can't we all come reason together, for instance. And has the country changed so much that that's out of date, it's out of style, it's out of touch.
And also every Republican, I think this is an important point, as someone who I've spent the last couple of days doing a lot of reporting in state parties and with local activists, and my sense is every Republican who signs on to legislation from the Biden administration will face a primary challenge, as well as every Republican who may vote to impeach the president. Like that the activists are already, the conservative activists, most of whom have very strong ties to Trump, are already preparing for that. And the thing to remember about this Trump wing of the party is that the president brought millions more voters into the Republican Party. So this is a force. These are voters that Republicans need. So it becomes a very difficult political calculation for them.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, which brings to mind Georgia. Talk about a giant story that has been lost in the last couple of weeks. I mean, there was a day or two of people paying attention to it, and then it evaporated. Julian, how big a deal was what happened in Georgia with those Senate races? And we know that there's not an actual, that only with the vice president's vote does that give them 51 if you include the independents that are caucused with the Democrats. But is that worth paying attention to or keeping in mind as we move forward? Let me start with Julian.
Absolutely. And I'm still processing, Lisa said before the insurrection before, which is just how far out politics has now become that we have that as part of our vocabulary. But Georgia was a big story. I mean, for the Democrats, it's a counterpoint to the growth of Republican voters for President Trump. Even though he lost, he expanded the number of supporters. I think this flip in Georgia, both in the presidential race and also in both Senate races, is significant because for Democrats, it whets their appetite for the kind of demographic promises we've been hearing about for a long time, that suburbanization, more educated voters in some of these areas is going to open the door.
Cobb County.
Exactly. And no, right. And so I think politically that is very important, as Arizona is, and they could start to see how this ongoing promise can actually come to fruition. And I think it will give a lot of Democrats some confidence to move forward with some of the key agenda items, such as climate change, that otherwise they might be more fearful about. And then in terms of the Senate, it is important. Look, I really believe Senator McConnell is going to be quite powerful, but it's still better to have a majority. And even if it's the narrowest majority you can imagine, it gives them room to push some legislation, but more importantly, to set the agenda. The Democrats will be able to lay out what the next 6-7 months will look like. And they can use Georgia to intimidate Republicans, meaning a lot of Republicans are fully in the orbit of where the party has landed, but they're going to be nervous about what happened in Georgia. They're not happy with that. That should be Republican territory, no longer is. And I think if Biden can play on that somehow, it might free up a few votes. We're talking about a few votes in the Republican Party. But control of the Senate is significant. Schumer, we'll see how he performs as majority leader. I think one last thing in terms of what Democrats can do and connecting it to this story, there are parts of an economic stimulus bill that will be appealing to Republican states, even if they don't like it. I often think that the increase in the individual payments is one issue, but assistance to the states wasn't in this package. And there are a lot of states, red and blue, that are bleeding right now, literally bleeding money, and they need relief. And it could be a little bit like Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, where even some red states find it a little more appealing than you'd think if Biden can get that moving in the mix. So there's a lot to the Georgia story, and I would just add that to part of what I think the administration should deal with.
You know, and Lisa, it's not very sexy, if you'll excuse the term, but, you know, in terms of judges, I mean, the Trump administration put hundreds of judges in jobs on the federal courts. And Lord knows there are still vacancies out there. It doesn't make headlines and it doesn't really make news on a day-by-day basis. But the number of judges he put in place, it's over 400.
Oh, it's staggering. And that's part of the reason we saw McConnell stick with President Trump for so long. That has been one of McConnell's major goals, was to remake the judiciary. And, you know, don't forget the Supreme Court seats as well, right? The court turned conservative for a generation under the Trump administration. So I think for a long time, more pragmatic-minded Republicans, particularly those in safer red seats who only had to worry about maybe a primary challenge, they could argue that they want to stick with President Trump, even though they maybe didn't agree with his rhetoric or some of his actions, because he was accomplishing their goals, right? So he was, you know, getting them the tax bill, the judges, but now he lost control of the Senate. Of course, he lost control of the House earlier. He lost Republicans control of the House in 2018, and he lost the White House. So it becomes harder, I think, for Republicans to see what they're getting out of this president. And I think that is actually part of the reason we have seen this break. Of course, there's so much horror and trauma around this attack on the Capitol. But I also think for McConnell, he sees that Trump's influence wasn't enough in Georgia. But it is worth remembering that the people who Trump's influence was very helpful for was the Democrats. The president has been a hugely energizing force for the Democratic Party during his term. And it is a real question for the Democrats how they maintain this level of energy, you know, without Trump around and without Trump in the White House, posing what a lot of their voters see as this eminent sort of existential threat to our democracy. I know from talking to Democratic strategists that there is a sense within the party that they kind of want to keep Trump alive as long as possible. I suspect we're going to be seeing him in Democratic campaign ads for, I don't know, a decade more, who knows? He's a deeply energizing force for the Democrats. He helped them outraise Republicans. He helped them take back the House. And he helped Biden win the presidency. Much of that we know was an anti-Trump vote. So the question facing Democrats is whether their grassroots are as energized by a Biden presidency, and also whether some of these voters, particularly in places like Cobb County, and I'm thinking here mostly of suburban male voters, but some of the women too, who maybe cross their typical party lines to vote for Democrats, to vote for Biden, and their vote really was a vote against the Trump administration, whether Democrats were just renting those voters and they're going to go home to the Republican Party, or whether they're going to stick with the Democratic Party. And I think that's part of what Biden is trying to do, that he feels that if he stays the course, you know, talks about unity, tries to strike out a more moderate position, he'll be able to keep those swing suburbanites and, you know, keep them in the Democratic fold. Of course, the cost there could be energizing the base. So it's always a balancing act.
And let me just jump in on just the other appointments too, cabinet level appointments, and anything that has to go through the Senate now can move pretty quickly. I'm sure had that not been the case, I'm sure Senator McConnell would have tried to block some of this or slow it down significantly, and not just the highest profile ones, but the kind of next level of appointments. And we're in an era where the executive action and work through the cabinets and that level of politics matters so much because of the difficulty of legislation. So that gives him a little window to fill the seats with who he wants, that I think will end up being pretty important for Biden's success or whatever success he can achieve.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if he had confidence that both of those seats had been filled by Democrats, if some of his choices might have been different or maybe a little more progressive. A couple of things that I have to stop and just two of the things that you said, Lisa, that really amused me were the renting the voters. I love that. I just love the idea of it's a one-time, one-off. The lease is short. There's no, don't count on us coming back to this place again. And the other one of keeping Trump alive. And I couldn't have this vision of a horror movie where the hand comes out of the grave. So yeah, both of those things. I really want to talk for a couple of minutes about Kamala Harris. We think about, when we look back at the Obama administration and we saw those, what it was like a weekly lunch that the president would have with the vice president. And there was this very chummy relationship, and his portfolio, I don't think, was particularly vast, but there were things like energy renewal. And anyway, he was involved, clearly involved. How do we think in this new administration, the president and vice president's relationship, how good is it now? What do we think? How deeply will she be able to have influence in the White House itself? Let me start with Lisa.
My understanding is they do have a decently warm relationship. I mean, these were not people who were very strong political allies before this moment and before the presidential race. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people remember that soon-to-be Vice President Harris leveled, one of the toughest attacks on Joe Biden and over race. But they really, what I heard from people around Biden is they work through that. They do have a warm relationship. Their spouses get along quite well. And Biden has said throughout, he was, with Biden, there isn't much of a private monologue often. He sort of just describes what he's doing as he's doing it. And one thing he said during his very vocal, many comments about his vice presidential search was that he wanted someone that he would be simpatico with, that he would have that relationship that he had with President Obama. And he picked Kamala Harris. So there is a sense that he will that she will have some real responsibilities in the White House, and she will be called upon as someone to advise. I think the major political overlay here is that Joe Biden is not a young man. Of course, he will be the oldest president to take office in the first term. And there are real questions about whether he will run for a second term. He himself has sort of described himself as transitional, which certainly does nothing to quell speculation on that front. Should he decide or be unable to run for a second term, she is the heir apparent. She is presumably the face of the Democratic Party. So I think even more than the normal vice presidential relationship, where the VP is always kind of thinking about their future on the side, I think even more than that, she will be scrutinized to see, what kind of moves she's making and how that could play for her own, potential future presidential ambitions. So I think in that way, the relationship will be unique. She is the first woman to be in the White House. She's the first Black woman to be in the White House and to be vice president. So there will be some gender and racial dynamics that the country will certainly have to navigate, as we move into the Biden administration. But my sense is that they do get along.
Julian, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a few. One is that vice presidents have just become more important since Walter Mondale in 1977, who was President Carter's VP. Other than maybe Vice President Quayle, we've just seen them take on a much bigger role. Obviously, Cheney was the most famous example of someone who had a heavy hand in the Bush administration, but even Biden himself, as you started in the question, understands the value of a vice president because that's what he did. And he understands the office is not what it was back when the famous statements were made about how worthless the vice presidency is. You have a narrow Senate. And so she is literally a key vote right now, a key person in making sure that the Democrats can move their legislation. And Biden is not going to take her lightly or kind of push her out of the inner circle, because he understands that success in the Senate will in many ways depend on her work and her relationships with other members. She brings great expertise. It's interesting to look at her resume, from criminal justice to foreign policy to court appointments. She's someone with a lot of gravitas. And I think at that level, she will just be very valuable as a voice in the room as he tries to work through this. And finally, in addition to the age issue, she has political value for him. At a crass level, she represents the new Democratic Party. So your earlier conversation about the cabinet, which looks very conventional, very familiar, she's not. She's the voice of the future. She embodies the more pluralistic, diverse element of Democratic politics, which Democrats certainly want to highlight. And so, why not have her as a valuable partner? So at all levels, I'm expecting her to be a pretty formidable vice president.
Well, what did Vice President? One second. And what did Vice President Biden say, or Obama say that And then we would meet him whatever was big. I would bring it to Joe last.
Yeah.
To either say yay or nay or whatever. Not that he had the final word, but that there was this sense that there was a partnership.
And don't forget, Biden was crucial to the stimulus bill in 2009 and 10, which is comparable to the first bill that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. So he worked on it. He worked with Jared Bernstein, the economist, on middle class issues and put it into the package, sold it to the Senate. And so I think he'll just have a real comfort level with relying on her to help him with the same kind of task.
And Lisa was going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say on Julian's point about the diversity of the party, it is important that we point out this cabinet is going to be the most diverse in history. I think we sort of cast them as all Obama retreads, and most of them did work in the Obama administration. But, Biden promised to have a cabinet that looked like the country, and he's delivering on that. I think another dynamic that's interesting about the Biden-Harris relationship is there are some parallels there. I think the Biden-Obama relationship has been a little recast in the retelling. I mean, they were not ever close before Biden was picked. He was picked largely because of his demographic appeal. I think the president, his advisors said, we need an old white guy to help us win this thing. And we saw some of the same dynamics with Harris. They made very clear that they wanted a female vice president because 6 women had run for the presidency, which would have been historic. None of them won the primary. But out of that dynamic, that sort of political pick with Obama grew a real relationship. So I think we could see the same with Harris. And she's someone who is a very loyal soldier. She's not going to break with them. She's not going to get out there. She's someone whose own policy views have shifted over time. So we know she's fairly flexible in that way. So I think that was also appealing to the people, to Biden and his orbit. But he is coming in with a lot of advisors who have been with him for decades and decades and decades. And it's hard to see that her word will jump the line of people who served with him in the Senate in the 1980s. So I think there will be some dynamics to navigate, as there are in every White House.
Don't say 1980s in such a disparaging manner. I was working in this business back then.
I mean, he's been in politics a long time.
Yeah, I've been doing this stuff for a little while too. The boy, I'm just, oh my gosh, when you think about different things that were important or issues that were important in the election and during the primary season, and things that were important. Can we just talk about science for a minute? Let's talk about science. Julian, the idea that with this pandemic still raging, and as of more than 4,000 dead in a day, and just this week, We're nearing almost 400,000 who will have lost their lives in this pandemic. We'll reach that number in a matter of days.
Yeah.
How important going forward is science in this new administration?
It's essential not just to elevate and rely on top scientists, but to rebuild trust. You think when you teach, Vietnam and Watergate, I often will obviously start by talking about all the distrust in politicians and in government that comes out of that era. And I think we're in a period where, because of what we've had in the last 4 years, a lot of distrust in science has now emerged at a pretty critical moment, combined with the way media and social media works that makes it harder to keep your eye on the facts, so to speak. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, not just for the next 6-7 months, to make sure people act in ways that scientists deem appropriate and to get the vaccines working the way they need to work, but just to dealing with public health challenges. This doesn't go away. Pandemics are something that are going to be a more familiar part of the landscape. And I think if President Biden can end 4 or 8 years, whatever his presidency ends up being, with restoring the role of science and scientists and dealing with some of these key issues and other kinds of experts, frankly, that would be a big achievement. I mean, we have fallen so far in our public comments where there are no common facts, there is no trust in people who actually have knowledge about the issues we are dealing with, that it's a kind of crisis. It's a political crisis. And if he can do that, it will affect other issues. It will affect how we can deal with climate change. It will affect how we think of economic problems, because once you've lost the belief in expertise, science and otherwise, it's very hard then to build support for legislation that will address these issues. But in the short term, that's mission number one as he tries to bring us out of this pandemic era that we're in.
So if you're the president of the United States, Lisa, can you convince people who have subscribed to conspiracy theories, who lined up, I almost said in lockstep, but lined up in lockstep with the idea that the election was stolen, of which there are a significant portion of Republicans who still believe that? How will we get to a point, or can the president help lead America to a point where it can believe in some common truths? And I wonder if, in the end of the day, maybe that's the biggest question.
I think you're right. I think that is the biggest question. And certainly the president can play a role in that effort, but I don't think the president alone can help the country agree on truth again. I mean, I think you have to look at the social media platforms. You have to look at all these various news outlets. Like, this is a societal problem. I do think one way where Biden can help is something that's so striking during the Trump administration was how everything the president touched became instantly political, right? I mean, I remember from the beginning when he denounced Hamilton, or Hamilton became a political issue. And these things that were civic life, but had been nominally apolitical, like sports leagues, right? The NFL all of a sudden became deeply political. I remember there was a point in the administration where straws became political because all these, local jurisdictions were banning plastic straws, and the president started selling boxes of straws that said Trump 2020 on them. And certainly the most obvious and perhaps most damaging and deadly example of this was masks. That mask wearing, because of the president, became a political statement. And I can tell you that when I've gone out reporting in different parts of the country, and I'm, standing on a street corner trying to talk to voters like, we do, it's become a lot easier to tell from a distance who's a Democrat and who's a Republican based on whether they're wearing a mask. It's not always a perfect measure, but 9 times out of 10, when I'm asking people about their politics, I'm I can usually tell based on whether they're wearing a mask. So I think having a president who doesn't politicize these things that are universal truths, like it is just a fact that masks help slow the spread of coronavirus, that they are perhaps our most powerful tool. So having a president who doesn't politicize things like that, things that are just true and facts, could go a long way. I don't think it solves our problem. I think a lot of supporters on both sides of the aisle are getting their information from more and more customized bubbles of information, whether that's partisan media outlets or that's online on social media and Facebook. So clearly, the social media platforms have a big role to play here, and I think there's definitely some I did wonder when they all decided to suspend and ban the president from their platforms, if some of that was in response to the deadly attack on the Capitol, and some of that was in response to the changing political realities of Washington, which is that Democrats are going to be in charge and may be more likely to regulate them.
And even with the challenges, I think the leadership challenges Lisa's talking about are really essential in a very concrete way in which the president can address this. But there's also other specific things he can do, even though this feels like a very amorphous problem. He could just staff all the key parts of government like CDC with respected, experienced scientists or civil servants who are sympathetic to listening to scientists. He can push for restored funding to agencies of government that focus on scientific research, and grants that have been cut in the last decade, way all beyond Trump, to fund the kind of investigations we need. He can push for college loans, which is an issue that all of the Democratic Party supports and some Republicans support, to get people in colleges, get us back to the JFK era where universities were valued and where we're kind of showing students the benefits of expertise because of their own interaction with that world. And those are all measures that I think are totally possible for this president that would go a long way. There are things that can be done to starting the process of changing the conversation about why expertise can actually be incredibly valuable on many key issues.
I wonder, if that's possible, because you think about the new frontier. I mean, we are actually, from the Kennedy Library having this conversation, at least virtually. Could Biden lead a different generation into believing in America's promise again? Like, they literally say, wipe a schedule, wipe some time and some damage and some thinking clear, and say, maybe, boy, I'm really in some Pollyanna space right now, but maybe we can all get along, and maybe we can find, maybe we are in fact indivisible, and maybe there are common truths that we can, and even tenets of belief that we can grasp together and figure out how to move forward.
Well, Lisa, go ahead.
I appreciate your Pollyannish thinking, and I wish I could get on that train with you, but I have to tell you, I just think we're going to be in it for a while still to come. I think we are seeing a pretty dramatic shakeup of both parties, a bit of maybe perhaps a realignment. I think the parties have less sway over their own members, in part because, the way fundraising works now, you can have a viral video and make a ton of money for your campaign. You're less, the system rewards people who appeal to the base. You're less dependent on your party leadership to advance, in politics. And I just think, if you look at how people get their news, if you look at even how people live, right? We know that people live more and more in communities that share their political beliefs, that there has been there are fewer of those politically mixed communities. I remember I saw some poll once that said that more people would be comfortable with their child marrying someone of another race than another political party, which I think does say something quite nice about race in America, but perhaps also says something about how we view our political identities. And I just think we're in this time that's deeply combative, that where both parties are really being led very strongly by their bases for a variety of different reasons. And it's hard for me to see how, the country really comes together. And frankly, I'm not sure that Biden is the person who's going to achieve that. I mean,
Right.
He really talked about his campaign, and a lot of times as a restoration, as a return to the Obama era in some ways, to those values. And what I wondered a lot when I watched him campaign was whether that was possible. And I think what this attack on the Capitol showed us is that it's not possible, that we are in new uncharted waters. I'm just hoping that we didn't go off the cliff, right? That we're just sort of still able to kind of pull things back. But I don't think any of this is going to be easy, or there's going to be some like kumbaya moment after Biden takes office. And part of that, of course, is the pandemic. I mean, we are in this just really difficult time in our country's history. It's really hard for a lot of people, and it will continue to be hard even once there's a vaccine. I think there's going to be, I started thinking a lot about the shadow pandemic and the effects that will linger of this moment for a long time. You think about education, mental illness, economic, people have lost so much economic wealth that will be hard for families to make up. I mean, this is going to be, I think we're in for a really hard and turbulent period, unfortunately.
Julian, you were about to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I am in agreement. I'm not one who thinks he has much chance to do that. I think he has to have more specific goals. I think he might be able to restore some confidence in our ability to govern and the ability of government to deal with problems. I think that's part of the idea of bringing in so many experienced hands to surround him and to help guide him. And that would be a big step forward if he can show in a few areas that we're able to actually deal with issues and address them. And I think a lot of younger people are waiting to see that. This is a younger generation that has been so let down. I think about that all the time, from issues such as, schools being safe from guns, to the climate that they live in, now to the pandemic. Our generations have failed to solve so many problems. It's not remarkable. They don't have a lot of trust in what Washington can do. And maybe there's a way in which this embodiment of government experience, we have not had a president like this, other than George H.W. Bush, really since the 1960s with Kennedy, LBJ, and even Nixon, but someone who believes in government, is from government, and has a problem-solving mind. That's how he thinks of every policy. Maybe he can make a little progress, especially after the last 4 years of total chaos, in restoring a sense that Washington can work, and Washington can, bring us things like a vaccine to save us from this. And I think that would be the kind of goal that's more plausible than bringing people together. But that would still be a very important step forward after what we've been through.
Yeah, if nothing else, just symbolically, I think you make a very good point, because as I talk to, especially 20 to early 30s, a wide number of people that age are completely disenchanted with government, period. They see the inherent corruption in terms of people running for office, be they Republican or Democrat, going into the private sector, dipping large, then coming back into government. That sort of cycle, we see some of that in some of Biden's appointees. There's just a sense that both are sullied, and neither are particularly palatable to plenty of young people. We've got some really good questions, by the way, from the audience, and they're coming in on my phone. So if it's all right with you, we're going to go ahead and plow ahead with some questions from the audience. Lisa, that's good by you?
Let's do it.
Julian, all right,
Yeah,
here we go. And there was one I had up here in just a second ago. This is good, because it gets us over to foreign policy, which we haven't touched at all. That was the whole idea of Trump's policy, especially towards China. Oh my gosh, you could go down the list. Maybe, okay, foreign policy. What if you have a first step and you're Joe Biden with regards to foreign policy, and this is kind of an amalgam of a couple of different questions that have come in, what might it be? What should it be? What should it not be? Lisa, let me start with you.
Well, I think foreign policy is actually one area where Joe Biden could have a big impact in terms of restoring America's reputation around the world. I think we've had a president who's been really comfortable with autocrats and despots, and Joe Biden is sort of going to return to the more traditional place of American foreign policy. So I do think that's an area where he can make an impact, and it's an area that he feels very strongly about. He was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is something he's very passionate about. He appointed one of his oldest, closest aides as head of the State Department. That's important because then when he travels abroad, Lincoln, foreign countries will know that he is speaking with the voice of the presidency. That's why you put someone like that in that role. So I do think the administration really wants to sort of work at one of their major early foreign policy goals is restoring America's reputation. I do think they'll certainly have, which will mean, re-entering international arrangements like the climate accords, NATO, things like that. But I do think that's an area where we'll see the administration want to play a role, and where it should be a little less, I think perhaps a little less contentious than some of their domestic priorities would be my guess.
Julian, one of the things I kept thinking about today as we're getting ready for this was just this notion of not having a big stick, and not speaking softly, and sort of pretending you have a big stick and confronting, say, for instance, North Korea, making friends, and then realizing, in the backwash that they're still doing basically whatever they want. And especially in terms of what we're hearing about with what's going on in Iran. We're going to back out of this deal because I don't like anything that had anything to do with Obama. And we're walking away from this, and we may be in a significantly more dangerous space right now with where Iran is in terms of its developing with nuclear materials. So that was my editorial soapbox. I will jump off of that. That's not really supposed to be my job here, but it's just like, oh my Lord. Julian, talk to me about foreign policy.
Well, it's about, I think what both of you are talking about is just re-engagement. I think, and he is someone who is well suited to do this. This is a politician, Biden, who came into politics in the 70s and 80s in the wake of Vietnam. And he was a generation of Democrats who was thinking of how do you strengthen America's role in the world after the disaster of that war, and how do you rebuild international alliances and think of military power in ways that don't involve massive, needless ground wars. And I think he's finding himself in a similar place right now. And I think, you have international institutions that, and treaties, frankly, not just on military issues, but on climate issues that President Trump just withdrew from. And part of the task of the administration will be a personal kind of effort to re-engage leaders, to re-engage our people with these institutions, and to be a much bigger presence in international conversations. And then the second task is to re-engage these hotspots where we didn't make ourselves stronger, but simply withdrew from the conversation altogether. With Iran, that's the story. We don't know what's going on. We don't have a hold really of what's happening in the way that Obama is trying to achieve toward the end of the administration. So I think beyond any military event that happens, those will be the two major fronts. I assume he'll also be tougher in terms of cyber warfare issues with Russia and other countries, given that's been such a big problem in the last 4 years. And Democrats have invested a lot of rhetoric in saying they would do it differently. Now's their chance. So that would be the third area I expect a lot of activity. And I would say one other thing, sorry. A lot of international policy challenges are not just about the military issues anymore. They really aren't. I mean, the climate issue, it was so important in the Obama years, and then President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. The pandemic is fundamentally an international problem, and we see that when you have poor relations with other countries and a lack of coordination, it's like within our country, it's disastrous. And so I think that's a framework for re-engagement that's going to be quite urgent in terms of how we live our lives here in the United States, that he's going to try to rebuild.
How about, I started to say China, and then because the word that needs to come after that is protectionism. And we look at, say, for instance, within the agricultural field, the billions and billions and billions of dollars that have been pushed out in subsidies. And then, in fact, the American consumer having to pay basically having to pay for it as a result of these sanctions and these and the blockages of goods and tariffs. Can those things be undone in a practical and I don't know, maybe not too time-consuming way? And just as an aside, I remember talking to a farmer friend of mine a year or so ago, and I asked him about the money he was getting from the government, and he's a very serious Republican. He said, and maybe they were in fact a little too generous. Can those things be dealt with in a practical and sort of swift way? Julian?
Yeah, not a practical and swift way. And I think this is a tension within the Democratic Party. It's not simply a partisan issue. I mean, there were many critics of, including Senator Sanders, of the open free trade model of the economy, which left so many Americans struggling, including many of the rural Americans who seem at this point lost to the Democratic Party. So I don't think President Biden's position can be, let's just go back to a Clintonian model of international trade. I think many people were suffering. And so he's going to have to figure out how to undo some of the protectionism that President Trump put into place, which many economists think ultimately doesn't help anyone and leaves us in a worse place. But also, and I don't know, I'm not a policymaker in this area, but I think to the 1930s, or I think to some of LBJ's programs, really kind of think about how the government can address some of the economic fallout of this new economic world we're in. Otherwise, I don't think it will be palatable to a lot of Democrats, and he'll have a political problem on his hands.
Lisa, we did some stories a year or so ago, really trying to dwell into policy with the array of Democratic candidates. But before we did an unscientific focus group with about a dozen Democrats in Eastern Pennsylvania. And we just talked for about 3 hours. And one of my takeaways was a lot of people in the United States can't afford to live in the United States anymore. And the cost of medical care, the cost of child care alone, for if two working parents with 2 kids who need child care, there was add that to a mortgage and a couple of car payments, and it's close to impossible. Is there a way that this new administration can make the economy or help the economy work for more people? And as an aside, we have more billionaires as of in the last 9 months than we had before. And of the people who are that rich, those billionaires, their wealth increased by more than $1 trillion just during the pandemic. That's one for you, Lisa.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's one of these shadow pandemic things I've been thinking a lot about. I think it's quite possible that we will emerge out of this pandemic with the richer people in America having grown richer by being able to save. We know from the economic data, they're saving more money. The market's been booming. And the people on the other side of the spectrum who are struggling even harder, that they've lost jobs, they've lost work, they've faced evictions. This has not been an easy time for a lot of people in America. And that reality is something that Biden is going to have to grapple with. And it was restoring the middle class. It was a major feature of his campaign. I think that will be a major thrust of his economic proposals. And I think some of that may come in the form of an infrastructure bill. I think that's one area where Democrats think they could get bipartisan buy-in and help, and also sort of help restore jobs that they see as good jobs, well-paying jobs, perhaps even union jobs. Unions obviously have been on the decline for quite some time in America. But I think we will see all those things really integrated into any economic proposal, perhaps after, I don't know if it will come in the first stage of the first economic bill, which I think will be focused more on the kind of emergency pandemic relief we were talking about, like perhaps more stimulus, continuing unemployment assistance, additional unemployment assistance, and money for state and local governments to keep them functioning. But I do think as we move into the administration, we will see them try to go with those kinds of proposals.
I wondered about that because remember that infrastructure was going to be this big thing, and it just languished. It languished, and it promises so many jobs. And Lord knows if you get on any road in the United States of America, it's just treacherous because it's in such bad condition. And we know that there were how many thousands and thousands of bridges that need to be replaced and everything else, and that couldn't get through somehow. Become prioritized during the Trump administration was one of those other sort of mysteries to me. It is interesting though, because as we talk about this and about economic inequality, one of the things that's happened over the last 10 years, while the number of people in unions is pretty stagnant, the Americans' attitude toward unions has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, or was highly, highly negative just 10 years ago. It's somewhere around 60+% positive toward unions. And I think that's got a lot to do with the gig economy, and especially what happened with jobs moving overseas, and this whole idea of the kind of transience of our modern world. And if you're a Democrat and if you're Joe Biden, maybe that an infrastructure bill with lots of union jobs might, and the other thing we know about the unions is so many people in unions have a completely different political philosophy than what Democrats historically did say in the decades past. It would be amazing to get an infrastructure bill passed. Julian, let's talk about race, because of the story that was of utmost importance for so many people in this last year was this sort of public trial that took place of how Americans viewed race. And especially after George Floyd, you saw this enormous outpouring of, for lack of a better term, is sort of a sense that, oh my gosh, now we get it. What happened then within weeks afterwards, after demonstrations sometimes turned violent and businesses were attacked, was that number then dropped again. If you're Joe Biden, can you lead America into some better form of racial reconciliation?
I think if you're Joe Biden, you have to. I think there's a moral demand to do something about the problem of racial injustice and racial inequality that was at the heart of every horrible video that we have seen circulate, and all the other statistics about how this pandemic was experienced differently depending on race and class. I think if he spends 4 years and doesn't try to address this, either through his Justice Department at one level and through his work with state government, which will also be quite important, it won't just be a missed opportunity. It will be a failing. It will be a huge failing. And at a practical level, African-American voters were hugely important to this victory, including in Georgia, the state we've been discussing now throughout our conversation. And if he just turns his back on these issues or says, politically, it's not something I'm going to deal with right now, I think there'll just be a lot of fallout at both levels. And I think Senator Harris, Vice President Harris, is committed to working on this. She has really evolved as a politician in terms of her commitment to these questions. But we can't afford to just kind of move on from the George Floyd moment. I edited a new edition a few years ago of the Kerner Report, which was the report that the Johnson administration put out after the riots in '67. And if you read the report, it's pretty stunning in that the issues are very similar to what we're talking about today in terms of institutional racism and policing. And the report starts that we've had other commissions and other reports on this over the years and nothing ever happens. And I don't think the Biden administration really can allow this to be a nothing happens moment. And again, this is an area you can connect to the pandemic and to economic recovery and to kind of thinking about how civil society works. But I don't know what he will do, but I believe it would be a mistake if he doesn't tackle this.
It's inconceivable that he wouldn't tackle it, in part because the country is already tackling it, right? Workplaces, companies are dealing with these issues. Local, state police departments are grappling with these issues of inequality and policing. So it will definitely be on Biden's agenda. It's inescapable that it could be on his agenda. And I think it's what his party and many members of Congress will demand is on his agenda. I think we'll see a lot of action at the Justice Department. I know some parts of the party were really disappointed. They were hoping that the Attorney General would, that they would, African-American Attorney General, someone who they thought might be more committed to these issues of policing and criminal justice, but I think Merrick Garland will tackle them as well. I also think you'll obviously see a very strong change in how we talk about race coming out of the White House. And I think in his words, President Biden will certainly try to heal those rifts rather than inflame them. We'll see how far that goes in this conversation, because the country really is going through this pretty intense reckoning. And I think we know from the polling that a lot of people's opinions on race have changed, that a lot of white voters have become a little more receptive to ideas of systemic bias and institutional racism.
I want to bring up a subject that has just occurred, something that's happening just in the last couple of days. These major corporations saying, some were saying we're not going to donate to the Republican Party. Some said we're not going to do any political donations anymore, period. Schwab said apparently today, we're done. We're done, all the way done. We're going to give all that money to boys and girls clubs and historically Black colleges. What Jamie Dimon and the Business Roundtable before COVID hit sometime, maybe 10, 11 months ago or so, came out and they said, we're going to spend more time paying attention to not just our shareholders, but our partners, the people who work for us, the people who do business, who are customers. There are things happening in our atmosphere that do and don't have to do with politics, especially those forward, I thought, really forward thinking and in their own way revelatory for these corporations to say, you know what, we're done with this. Could we be at a point where K-Straight becomes irrelevant, where corporations aren't leaning on every possible piece of legislation to have their voices heard, overwhelming whatever John Q. Public is out there saying and Jane Q. Public are saying? What about us? Is that possible?
Again, I'm going to shoot down the Pollyanna thinking. I'm sorry. I hate to be like the Darth Vader of this conversation, but I'm a really big skeptic about those corporate donations. First of all, corporate PACs, which is what we're talking about here. I mean, for the first of all, a lot of the companies said they were suspending the donations, which does not mean eliminating the donations. It's unclear how long the suspension lasts. And frankly, the year after a presidential election is not when these candidates are raking, doing the most muckraking anyhow. This is generally a slower year in the world of political money. Second of all, these corporate PACs are simply not a big part of the money that Senate candidates, certainly presidential candidates, raising. Maybe in some House districts where there's one dominant industry and more local races, it could be more significant. But generally, they're capped at $5,000. This is not where the big money is flowing into politics. Symbolically, as a point of against money in politics, I think it is helpful and it can be important, but that's not what these companies are talking about. They're not saying that we think the corporate influence in government is too great. They're saying we don't want to be involved with Donald Trump because he's like a really toxic brand for us right now. That's what this is about. So and they're also,
although some said
point,
they were going to stop donating to not just Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
But to your point,
that
yeah,
sort of
absolutely,
gets them
it's
out
bad.
of a tough call. And
right,
to your
it's bad
point,
for the brand. Yeah.
What they did not say is that they're not going to spend money on lobbying. In fact, I suspect money spent on lobbying to go up. It's a really good time to be an ex-Democratic Hill staffer because now you're in high demand by all these lobbying shops to try to, work through all this legislation with Biden. And I think there is a sense that there will be more regulation under a Biden administration. So in fact, lobbyists will be more in demand. So I just don't. I think it is really interesting. I think it's these moves speak. And I think it could be a problem in terms of an image problem for the Republican Party as they grapple with who they are, what they are, how they deal with Trump. But I think that this is something that's pretty localized, that is about President Trump, and it's not changing the corporate influence in government, and it's not impacting, the massive flow of money into politics. But maybe Julian is more optimistic. I don't know.
Not at all. Not at all. If I had a sign, agreed, I would have it. It's a structural issue. We have a system that depends on private donations and where lobbying has immense sway. Unless you change the way the system works and you change campaign finance and you impose really tough and enforced lobbying regulations, this isn't going to go away. You might have a few corporations who do this or suspend it or suspend certain areas of activity. But overall, I don't think business is withdrawing from the political world. They might be distancing themselves a little bit right now from the GOP, which just faced a presidentially incited insurrection by white extremist groups, which if it takes that, it's probably not going to be very durable. The more kind of interesting thing to think about is small donations, which have become much more important politically, and candidates have figured out ways to raise lots of money from small amounts. Both parties have done this pretty well. And I think in a lot of the campaign finance world, that's more of the question, not will corporations change, because they won't, but can you find other bases, at least in elections, of raising money or incentives for small money donations that at least counteract some of what K Street has to offer. But unless we go through reforming campaign finance, businesses will be more than happy to find ways to influence government.
I'm sorry. I got carried away. It just was like this dream. I'm dreaming out loud in some, I don't know, alternate universe. I have one more serious question, and that is, will the Biden administration, will the Democrats try to grow the court, try to grow the Supreme Court?
I don't think so. I mean, Biden has, I think there was a moment when that could have happened. I think Biden doesn't want to tackle that issue. He remembers the 1938, the 37-38 period when FDR tries it. There's a backlash in the 38 midterms, and that's how he thinks of the problem. And he's not particularly eager to go into that, especially now. And with this majority, and I'm sure some of the Democrats wouldn't go along with that. I'm just not sure that's on the table anymore. A lot of these institutional reform issues, which could have been in play had Democrats a 58, 59 person majority or 60, I just think the wind has been taken out of that, even though there's more Democrats who think about that as something important down the line.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think but I think you have a really interesting point, which is in some ways, like obviously politically, Biden would have preferred to have a much broader majority in the Senate. That makes his life a lot easier, makes it much easier to get legislation. But, having this narrow margin, I think actually forces may force legislation that really falls in line where Biden himself is, which is that he's a liberal centrist. He's not someone who's really prone to agree with these, proposals that have come out from the left wing of the party, like, expanding the court, and he can't get them through Congress. So it makes it really easy for him not to have to engage in those conversations. I also think certainly in the first 6 months, a year of his administration, he wants to keep his agenda fairly squarely focused on the pandemic, on the economy, because he knows come those midterms, which by historically, if we're looking at history, should be, bad for the Democrats, that those will be the issues that voters will likely be judging him on. So I don't think we'll see that taken up.
So someone is clearly on the same page I am here a little bit, and they pose this question. They say the late historian Arthur Schlesinger suggested that there are cycles in American history after what the country has gone through in the last 4 years, and especially after last Wednesday. Will we soon have compromise and an end to divisiveness? And if not that, at least a move away from that, or some sense, especially among the people who have been elected to office, that there's got to be a better way to move forward. Lisa, first you.
I'm skeptical. I think we are a moment where the bases of both parties have really moved to their respective corners, and both parties have moved. Democrats have moved further to the left, Republicans have moved further to the right. And I don't think that changes just because Biden is elected. Democrats were driven by defeating Donald Trump, and many Democratic voters believe that Biden was the safest choice to do that. It wasn't that they particularly loved his agenda or his policies. It was a practical vote in that they thought they could defeat Trump. And I just think the issue, I think we're in a moment now that rewards activity on the extremes, right? It's easier to get attention. It's easier to raise money. There's certainly all kinds of ways online where people can meet and spread ideas. In fact, what I'm thinking these days, what I'm thinking more about than unity is domestic terrorism, and how the country is going to confront what is pretty clearly a serious domestic terrorism problem that's lurking, organizing in corners all over the internet that it's unclear if, we can track. So I think that's kind of more, sadly, I think that's kind of more where the country's head is at. I think there are certainly a lot of Americans who would like to see unity, who would like to see a government that gets things done, and who would definitely like not to have to think about politics every minute of every day of their life. Like, everyone wants the news alerts to stop. That is one thing that I think all Americans can unite around. I'm just not sure that our political system and the moment we're in, with such, unbelievable historic changes, a pandemic and a struggling economy, these parties have moved to the extreme, factions that have really moved to the extremes, is a system that's going to lead us towards unity in this moment.
Lordy, right?
Sorry.
Listen, I agree with so much of what you just said. Julian, thoughts?
Yeah, Schlesinger is a great historian, a big influence on mine, but I never thought his cycles of history theory worked very well, because the problem is institutions are very sticky. The processes of politics don't change very easily. And what we learn over time is the cycles, ideas, it doesn't really capture how politics works. And the forces behind the reasons we are so polarized, or the forces behind why the Republican Party has moved in the way it does, those don't go away with Biden being president. The structure of the media is very similar. The composition of the parties has not fundamentally changed, and so on and so on. And so it's hard for presidents to remake the political landscape. And so I think more will be the challenge of Biden to figure out how to govern it all in this fractured, difficult terrain. The only kind of more optimistic note is that the Trump presidency was so extreme. We're talking much more than polarization and divisiveness. We're talking about 4 years of, I think, profound instability in the White House, culminating with this week, that it will obviously be better than that. There'll be some move toward a little bit of normality, but the cycles doesn't capture how politics works. So we are in a polarized, fragmented, fractured age of politics, and that doesn't end anytime soon.
And Lisa was mentioning about what gets attention, and Julian, you've written about that so wonderfully, going back to Newt Gingrich, right? Who was, when we dismantle all of this and pull all the strands apart, that's one of the places to start. Well, so yeah, right. Oh my God.
And that's for for the Republican Party, it's a question that goes beyond Trump's presidency ending. I think all the issues we have talked about with the GOP and the nature of the party that has emerged, there'll be a lot of soul searching in the party if they want to be serious about changing, because overall, like American politics, the GOP will not be transformed January 20th and 21st. This is the party. And that was kind of part of the argument of the Gingrich book, but I think it's going to be a very important issue in the next 4 years if there's any movement at all within the party to change its ways.
Wow. Well, we asked you to, gaze into your into your crystal balls and try to look forward to what's going to start happening in just a week from today. And we so appreciate both your expertise, your years of hard work, and your historical understanding of this country we live in. And so for Lisa Lerer and Julian Zelizer, we just want to thank this audience of the Kennedy Library for hanging around and listening to all that we've had to say in the last 90 minutes or so. I just want to very quickly, Lisa, do you want to get a last word in? Is there anything you want to chime in our last 90 seconds or 2 minutes here?
I wish I could be more optimistic, but look, maybe I'll be completely wrong. I think if there's one thing that we know about politics in this moment, it's that nothing is predictable. We really don't even know what the next week will bring. So maybe despite all our negative prognosticating, we will be ushered into an era of unity and kumbaya. Here's hoping, right?
We can dream. We can dream.
We can dream.
Look, let's just start with trying to curb this terrible virus that has just been devastating in terms of lives, social, civic society, and the economy. And if this administration can make progress on that in the next 6 months, it will feel like a game changer for all of us, so we can actually be in rooms together. And kind of that's the top of my wish list at this point. And that would be the way to at least start a process of getting better.
Julian, Lisa, thank you so much. I've had a good time. I hope it's been okay for you too as well. And so for the Kennedy Library, we just wish everyone a good night and wish the new administration good luck and Godspeed as it moves forward with its agenda and our continued hope of a more united America, an America that provides benefits for all of its citizens. Good night, everybody.
Good night.